encroachment of about 14%. And on the southern portion, showing about a 19% encroachment where there's an allowance for about 65%. In the areas where this is allowed, we are imposing, and then we're allowing for permitted obstructions for the solar systems and other energy systems. So the photovoltaic cells would be allowed on top of the site under the proposal. Just think, the one other thing I wanted to mention, is it here? Okay. There are controls regarding distance between buildings. We want to make sure that the buildings are sufficiently far apart, and as we move up in the stack again, want to make sure that the controls push the buildings farther away. So for the portions below a height of 180 feet, buildings, if they're separated, need to be separated by at least 8 feet. Above a height of 180 feet, they need to be separated by at least 60 feet. So it's a pretty large jump. Looking at the master plan, at the lower levels, the current buildings are located between about 40 feet, and at the closest areas. And at the highest levels, they're located about 60 feet apart. So those are the controls for that one. And because we have a campus which is being built out over 20 to 25 years of time, we wanted to make sure, even though we've created, we think, a lot of flexibility and one that works well from a bulk standpoint, we are including a proposed authorization that would allow for Cornell in the future to apply to make a modification to those bulk controls if they can be demonstrating that the changes would result in a better site plan, both for the campus as well as for the users in the area and for Roosevelt Island, that the changes permit adequate access to light and air to the surrounding streets and properties, that there's no increase in bulk that's to the detriment of the users nearby, and that the change is necessary to further the programmatic requirements of the campus. Sorry, this is a lot, I know. So that was the bulk piece of it. Parking. Under current zoning, there is a parking requirement, and there is a very large allowance for permitted parking. The parking requirement is one space for every residential unit that would be proposed. The program has about 1,100 spaces, so that today there would be a requirement for 550 spaces. There is an allowance for more than 2,000 spaces on the site. So we thought that what was allowed was excessive, and we thought that a requirement probably doesn't make so much sense for Roosevelt Island. So what the text would do for parking was eliminate the parking requirement entirely, and it would cap the permitted amount of parking to 500 spaces. Okay, so public access. Typically, from a zoning standpoint, if there's a requirement that there be open space on the site, it's private open space. In the special district, what's being required from a zoning standpoint is that at least 20% of the development parcel be not only improved as open space, but be made publicly accessible. It's going to be phased in over the course of the development. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the text is very clear that the requirement exists, and it establishes 3 required elements that would be part of that open space program. One would be the north-south connection, and that's the central spine that Colin spent time talking about. That would be the heart of the campus. It would be the main entry into the campus, and it would be that would be one of the open spaces. The second is a central open area that would be located along the western side of the campus in the mid-block. And the third would be a waterfront connection corridor to make sure that there are connections that allow for east-west pass through the campus as well as the north-south camp. The open space is required for the most part to be open to the sky, and it's required for the most part to be located within 5 feet of grade. and it's required to be open to the public for set hours between 6 and 10 p.m. between April 15th and October 31st, 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. for the remainder of the year. This is a diagram of those spaces, of the requirements. So the north-south connection coming through here, and these are part of that. The central open space in this area, and a connection from the west loop road to the east loop road. There's requirements about location of the various elements. For example, the central open space isn't required by zoning to be exactly right here, but it is required to be at least 300 feet south of the northern border and at least 300 feet north of the southern border, so somewhere in this location here. Some general requirements for it. The central open space has to have a frontage along the West Loop Road of at least 150 feet, a minimum size of about 30,000 square feet. As I said, 300 feet from the northern and southern borders, and it needs to connect up to the north-south connection, because we want to make sure that these open spaces work as a network, that people are able to sort of walk through and enjoy all of the open spaces in the area. The north-south connection needs to have a minimum width of 50 feet, has to have a clear path, and if there are coverings that the coverings need to be at least 30 feet high. It also needs to connect to the east loop road and the west loop road. The waterfront connection corridor needs to be at least 30 feet wide with a clear path of 12 feet within that. And then if there are additional areas, there's the requirements about the size with a minimum size of 20 feet. And all of any supplemental area needs to be able to connect on to those other, to the other open space areas. There's requirements for seating. There's requirements for landscaping. There's requirements for a number of amenities to make sure that these spaces are functional and work for all of the community, both Roosevelt Island as well as the Cornell campus. There's some opportunities for kiosks, and I think that that's probably most of these controls. Again, I know this is a lot. This, and you've seen this diagram already, but again, just in terms of if you want to put the renderings that you've seen to the required elements, this would be an example of the north-south connection. You'd be walking through that central tech walk. You've got the central open space on one side, but this would be an example of how that north-south spine might work. And here is an example of the central open space. And open space at night. Okay, so I think that's the zoning text. Just a little bit more. Again, so there's a lot of open space. It's about, in terms of a requirement, it's about 105,000 square feet. Wanted to make sure that the open space gets built in a way that works with development proceeds. So there's a requirement from a zoning that Cornell has to bring the open space online as the projects move forward. So for the first 300,000 square feet of floor area, at least 25,000 square feet of open space needs to be created. For 500,000 square feet, at least 40,000 square feet. And it goes on, so for the next 12,000 square feet for every 200,000 square feet of development thereafter. And what this works, and so that means that you'll be seeing open space as you see development. And how it really works is that when phase one is done, that the central open space and the north-south connector going to that open space will be completed at that point. Just that's sort of how the math works. I know, yeah. And then there's a no-build volume, which is just to want to keep one view corridor above the site. The additional actions, and we have very few slides on these, is the city map amendment, which relates to the street itself. The city map is the dark line that you see here. So this, right now, this is not part of the city street system, and the it will become part of the city street system connecting up to Main Street. And this diagram that you saw before, so we won't go through that. And then the last action will be the disposition itself. The city will be conveying the development parcel to Cornell. It will be in the form of a long-term ground lease with some opportunities for future conveyance. And I think that is it. I think this is just showing the disposition area. Do you want to do the timeline?
No, you're done.
And so, as we're right now, we just started. We were just certified, and we'll be starting the ULURP process next Monday. The plans would be to commence demolition in 2014. The campus will be open in 2017 with a full build-out of the campus projected 20 years later.